Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So today we're talking about Trent Dougherty's response to uh, Tom Senor, and Dougherty is defending uh, religious justification, right? The religious justification of the what he calls the person in the pew, right? And he characterizes Senor's argument as this: premise one, if evidentialism is true, then no naive believer is justified. Two, some naive believers are justified, therefore, evidentialism is false, right? And Dougherty goes on to note, although this argument is undoubtedly valid, it will be hard for it to be cogent. Now, what cogent means, gang, is you have an inductive argument and an argument, say, to the effect of all crows are black. Every crow I've ever seen is black, ergo all crows are black, right? What that means then is that an inductive argument with true premises is going to be cogent, right? It'll never possess deductive demonstration like 2 + 2 = 4, right? Uh, but it will raise the overall probability, is what we're saying, right? So anyway, uh, Dougherty notes, though this argument is undoubtedly valid, it will be hard for it to be cogent because it's hard to read naive believer in any way other than believer who lacks positive evidence for their religious beliefs. It's a view he's attributing to Senor. This reading makes it a pretty trivial argument. For the argument not to be trivial, Senor needs there to be witnesses in the pews who really do lack positive evidence in the relative sense. However, that's just what I deny. But now we have to ask, okay, Dougherty, what is religious evidence, positive religious evidence in the relevant sense, right? And this is where he really, in my opinion, gets vague. And frankly, to my way of thinking, he indulges in some wishful thinking. Wishful thinking being a logical fallacy whereby we forget that our wanting something to be the case is irrelevant, excuse me. Our wanting something to be the case is irrelevant to whether or not it actually is the case. And unfortunately, wishful thinking is a very, very prevalent fallacy. And again, I think that Dougherty is indulging in some here. Let's go to his words, right? Page 155. Specifically to answer Senor's question, the average person's good evidence that God exists is their awareness that life just makes the most sense when viewed from a framework that includes a belief in God. Now, again, this not only is it just wishful thinking, but there's a lot of vagueness and ambiguity there, right? Life makes the most sense. I mean, what's that supposed to mean? That it's cogent, that it's coherent? But the mere fact that a tale or a story or an account is coherent does not, in and of itself, make it true. You need some evidence, right? He goes on. The believer sees the world as the product of some kind of plan. Seeing as is a common phenomenon. For instance, when we judge people's emotional states, we see them as happy or sad or excited or whatever. This is where I think this is a weak analogy, right? If I see you walking up the street and you have tears in your eyes and your shoulders are slack and you just seem down, I have physical evidence, right? When human beings are displaying these kinds of physical characteristics, right, it's usually associated with a depressed mood, right? Uh, there's physical evidence, in short, to back up my assessment that you're in a depressed state, right? And seeing the world as some kind of plan is question begging. In other words, circular reasoning, again, assuming the truth of what you're trying to prove, right? Uh, and this permeates a lot of Dougherty's writings. But going on, he notes, the believer recognizes the characteristic fingerprint of God on the universe. I'm not exactly sure what he means by that. I mean, I completely have no idea, right? Um, Again, question begging, in my opinion, right? There's no more need for the believer to have explicit arguments for God's existence and for the average person to have explicit arguments connecting facial expressions to emotions. If that's what your view comes to, then you should adopt the view of the 4th century Christian theologian Tertullian, who argues that the existence of God is so incomprehensible to humans that as to be absurd, and hence no argument we could make could begin to satisfy an account of how extensive God is or be adequate to the task of proving God, because God is just completely and utterly beyond our comprehension. Um, Again, I think that's a weak approach, and I agree with St. Augustine that if there is a God, then presumably God would give us some degree of understanding of God's characteristics. Uh, But again, this is the problem for the believer, right? What constitutes evidence for your position, right? And I'm not saying, if faith makes your life better, cash out better as you will, then fine and dandy, right? But every single account, like Dougherty's that I see, is just full of circular reasoning and wishful thinking, and not to mention confirmation bias on top of it, right? Confirmation bias being a psychological tendency to seek out sources of information that confirm what you're already inclined to believe. Um, this is just, in my opinion, a really weak argument. Um, but I leave that for you to decide. Um, Next week, we'll be beginning to examine the question of whether or not scientific explanations are adequate to describe the world.